slum development that was being proposed there, despite the existence of children's networks in the area. So just sort of having an undifferentiated community participated, I don't think is enough. You need to sort of start looking at different categories that might be affected and excluded even within these participatory processes. The third category of such groups would be the disabled, who tend to be the most marginalized. Nobody sort of thinks about the blind or the deaf, etc., when planning in our cities. So the second main point I want to make regarding where further research should go, and one of the chapters does point in this direction, is that despite there being several solutions being proposed or reforms being proposed, we don't have good assessments of their impact. We don't have where they've been worked, how well they've worked, and why they've worked where they've worked. What are the factors or conditions that have enabled them to work where they have? And this is becoming an increasingly important task, as investing scarce resources in a plethora of platter of reforms that might not have the desired impact is not a good idea. We need to be a bit more strategic in thinking about, which are the processes that can actually lead us to the kind of inclusion outcomes that we desire. Okay, then finally, I have a little bit more time. Two other issues quickly. Or maybe three. One issue that I think is critical is exclusion of the poor in security, in urban security. Safety turns out to be one of the main issues that the urban poor are concerned about. And unfortunately, they're the most affected by violence and insecurity. But they're also seen as violent and dangerous themselves. So areas of the poor where pockets of are seen as dangerous and violent tend to be where the poor live. Research, particularly from cities in Latin America that are characterized by high levels of urbanizations, there's over 80% urbanizations in cities in countries in Latin America. Inequality and violence suggests that several things can happen. There's the production of a vast population of informal people, or people living in informal settlements, engaging in informal work. We didn't talk a lot about the whole issue of informality in urbanization processes here, and I think it also raises, as an aside, it raises questions of legitimacy of local urban governments. If you say 80% of your population is living in informal settlements, is doing informal work, it's not part of any of your formal processes. So this is a problem. We know that the withdrawal of the state as effective protectors of these large areas of informality, or sometimes the state is even an active perpetrator of violence in these areas, and this can become a major issue. In India, we haven't reached that level of urbanization, inequality, or violence yet, but I think we need to raise these issues and deal with them now before things happen. And I think recent events, say in Delhi and other places, suggest that this is likely to be an issue that requires attention. The second issue I want to raise here is that I think there's been an effective exclusion of the poor from public spaces, either through sealed-off zones of the better off, gated communities, for example, or privately controlled what are seen as public spaces. So, for example, the malls, which are largely used by the better off, undermine the possibilities of imagining a city collective together. There's sort of as universal citizens of an urban space. This growing fragmentation and segregation of social and public space in cities throughout the world, including India, although perhaps India is not hasn't reached that stage yet, is of concern. An item in yesterday's newspaper, I think, illustrates this problem quite nicely. The headline reads, "Brazilian flash mob forces upmarket shopping mall to close." What happened was that favela residents, favelas are slums in Brazil, in the hundreds were to occupy an upmarket mall, which in normal circumstances they would never have been allowed to. And such occupations, or as they call rolezinhos, have become increasingly common in Brazil as a means of the poor seeking inclusion into the city, sort of capturing space that they have been so far excluded from. So I think it's important to pay attention to some of these processes. The main point I want to make here in the end is that we cannot make urban policies in some sort of a technical manner. We have to pay attention to the politics and the pressures from below. Plans made from a purely technical perspective without attention to the political economy of urbanization in particular are going to be problematic, and we'll have all kinds of problems of implementation of the kind perhaps that Paul was pointing out in the earlier session. So it's really important to understand how politics works in cities, to understand how the economics can work right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anuradha, for a very comprehensive presentation. By way of a quick comment, I would say that my own conclusion about the experiments in India, and I was not looking globally at everything that happened in different countries, was not very different. I do say that it had mixed results, including my own work. For example, in Bangalore, where the first report card was produced and we went public and so forth, government just kept quiet. There was no response at all. It took another exercise after 2 or 3 years for them to wake up and ask questions or come forward. The basic point is that whether it works or not, this is a function that citizens need to perform. That we are a major stakeholder, and for the reasons we heard in the morning, when a government doesn't monitor what it is doing, and Montek said that just put the money into the silo, that's what matters. And this is actually happening in the sanitation program. Recently, some little field work showed that toilets are not being used, but the money has been spent and certified that it is working. Actually, NREGA money is also now going in, and that is financing the extra work the contractor is doing unnecessarily to add to the cost of the toilet. And we think they're being used, and there are reasons why they will not be used. A government which doesn't monitor these things doesn't know what is happening because the knowledge is being kept away from them. So getting feedback, listening to them is the only way to correct monitoring failures. And if government doesn't do it, the ultimate stakeholder, the citizen, should do it, or intermediary organizations. If the poor are not able to do, there are many other organizations who will stand in and make their voice heard. So my basic argument is that this is a basic function that we as citizens need to perform, not just the poor, middle class. You're seeing that right here in the city now. It may have, like all the reforms that you talked about and how they fail, this will also fail. Or it will go 2 steps forward and 3 steps backward and so forth. But I personally feel, given the monitoring failure and the lack of interest of our political class very often to see what is happening and improve systems, it is more a case-by-case situation. If your problem is solved, my friend's problem is solved, that's all that I monitor. Nothing more is required. This culture has to be challenged, and this is an effort. Therefore, I'm giving the array of tools which have been used in order to play that role, and it is going to take time. Therefore, in the morning when we heard about your failures in reform, that plus what we are now discussing, we should think of them all as work in progress. Don't expect perfection. It's not going to happen. We don't know what the perfect policy is anyway. So we should be willing to learn. And that is where the government is failing. If you don't monitor, you will not learn. You are not getting the facts and factoring it into improving. I don't know how they have done it in Jain. I tried in Bangalore after Mohanty and others that we should check on. There was absolutely no interest in monitoring or others getting involved in looking at what is happening. So how do you then, after 5 years, you say money is not utilized or things are not working well? You could have found that out in 6 months and corrected if you are interested in. This is the failure that we are trying to tackle. Therefore, of course, this goes beyond the urban sector. It's a more generic governance problem. That's a value I see. Therefore, I wanted to make this comment. I want to ask Bimal and both of you now to speak about your paper or other related issues. And then we will open up the discussion. Is that okay, Anuradha?
I think when we wrote that paper, we didn't know that it will be clubbed under governance and inclusive growth. Probably the language would have changed, but the substance probably would have still remained. Uh, I'm not going to present the paper as such, but the morning's discussion has probably provided some backdrop in terms of what we have tried to state in this. I think it was very strongly stated that externalities demand interventions in the market. And town planning is an example of not considering externalities as the cause, but it has been largely axiomatic and driven by the sense of good city. And that naturally does not explicitly consider the requirements of inclusive growth. And that is what we are reflecting in the way in which the plans are done. In fact, many states have moved to a common set of regulation for all cities, which is quite contrary to doing a planning for a city-specific purpose. How the plans are done, that also influences what is the access to affordable housing. And there we have done the comparison of Ahmedabad and Mumbai. Mumbai probably does a more excessive land use planning and has more exclusion in terms of what people would do. Apart from the physical planning requirements and regulations, etc., I think we have also cited the importance of the transaction processes and the costs. There is a diagram in the paper which shows that how long and how tortuous the route is before you could get a permission on a land to build something. And that reflects in the prices and the cost. Not only that, but given the pace of growth of cities, it also slows down the process of building which are required. In the morning, we were also saying that the cross subsidies are justifiable in delivering services. But whether that is applicable to housing, that needs to be questioned. And Mumbai is an example where cross subsidies have been used in the sense that if you build houses for the slum dwellers, you get an incentive to build for the what is in Mumbai called sale component, that the developer could sell those things. What it has meant that the government has argued we have promised free houses to all slum dwellers. And once they promised the free houses to slum dwellers, the people in the rent control buildings also demanded the free houses. So today in Mumbai, there is a promise by the state to provide for 70 to 80% of the people free houses. When that will come, nobody knows, but that's not the issue, that there is a promise there. What it has done is that every new home buyer in Mumbai, because Mumbai is an island and doesn't have much of greenfield expansion, most of the development is brownfield, so every new home buyer has to finance this promise of providing free houses to 70% of the people. So what do you have? You can buy a house for not less than 1.5 crores of rupees in Mumbai, even in the most distant suburbs. And if you have 30 to 40 lakhs of rupees, what do? You go and buy the houses which were given free to the slum dwellers. So that is how the housing situation in Mumbai has been. Economists always discuss the market distortions because of regulations. But I think in urban field, it is not just the distortion of the markets. There are people very smart. They try to bypass the regulations. And the scale of so-called unauthorized development is so large that the states have started using it as a fiscal resource. That you identify the unauthorized development, charge the money, or if people want to deviate from the regulations, you charge the money and allow them. Mumbai has these charges for deviations from the rule as one of the major sources. It brings in something like 500 to 800 crores of rupees every year. That is, suppose the rule says that you must have the open space around buildings in relation to height, h by 3. Now, nobody can provide h by 3. They